You're listening to the Let's Be Real podcast. Now, here's your host, Andy Hughes.
Our guest right now is a fantastic leader who is making a giant impact on many people. He is the CEO of Giant TV, the co-founder of Giant, a speaker, and a best-selling author. In 2019, he released a book called The 100X Leader, How to Become Someone Worth Following, which made the 2019 Amazon Top 10 among leadership books. We're very excited to have Jeremie Kubicek on the Let's Be Real podcast. Jeremie, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Andy, doing great. Thank you. I love being with you, and thanks for the chance.
Absolutely. We're so thrilled to have you. And before we talk a little bit about your amazing book, I'd like to know a little bit more about your story. I know you originally went to Russia and you worked there, and then you came back to the United States, and you have an interesting path. Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about your journey to becoming the CEO of Giant TV?
Yeah. So I have an entrepreneurial background, and so I've been a part of 21, 22 different ventures or companies, and starting them, building them, growing them, so some selling them. And it started with when I was in college. I had this professor who said, he showed me how to use business as a platform for influence and impact. And I was like, you mean you can? How do you do that? So I moved to Moscow, started the Moscow Economic School with some Russian partners, and teaching ethics to the capitalist world that was brand new. This is 1993, you imagine. So I'm teaching about Snicker bars and Coca-Colas and, just some real basic things. And the idea was, we can do good and really grow a business. So we built a marketing company, an accounting training company, a educational platform that still exists today. And then I moved to the States, and I worked for someone. My dad gave me this wisdom: in your 20s, son, it's not what you do, it's who you work for that's most important. So I found the person I wanted to work for, and I ended up selling, this sounds so funny, selling African-American hair care products to grocery chains. That's not what I thought I would end up doing with my life, but it was who I worked for. It was the Humphreys family, and they trained me on how to do business in an amazing way, excellent way. And then they got bought out, and I worked for the private equity group that bought them, and we got on an acquisition spree, and I was a part of a roll-up of companies and acquiring companies, and all of that goes into private equity, and eventually started my own business in 2002 called Giant. So that's how I got to where I've gotten. And then we ended up buying a few companies. Some people know John Maxwell. We bought John Maxwell's assets, and then we built the Catalyst conferences, and started something called the LeaderCast, a kind of a global leadership event, and then started writing and creating my own content, which is where I'm at today with the CEO of Giant.
Very cool. I like that saying you said, it's who you work for. I think that is very important, and it's something different, something I've never really heard of before. So that's awesome advice that you were given there. Now, I mentioned off the top there, you had spent some time in Russia. I think you lived in London. How important were those experiences for you, just understanding those different cultures? Because I think that's really important when it comes to leadership. You really have to understand those other cultures.
Yeah, we're all made up of a combination of nature, nurture, and choice. So we have this nature is our personality, it's our wiring, it's kind of the DNA, chromosomes, all those things we were made at. So we all have born sets of skills and superpowers, but our nurtured upbringing is it impacts us. It really affects us. So for instance, I was born into a Czechoslovakian family in Oklahoma. So therefore I have this Czech heritage in the heartland of America. And then I moved to Russia, and I had that choice, and that experience gave me, a broader perspective. And then I've moved my family. We lived in London, and I've lived in Atlanta, and all these different perspectives. So I think the problem with a lot of people is called the echo chamber. They get into a room and everyone's doing group speak, and they think they're all right, but they may not understand where their customer's coming from, or they may not understand the market and where the direction of a market. And I think that's important, just to understand culture, to get out of your echo chamber. So, it helps scale a leader, and their influence will grow. And that's that culmination of nature, nurture, and choice.
That's very interesting. And you know what? Another interesting thing that I heard you say was your concept of leaders needing to lead themselves before leading others. Sometimes we see leaders come into a new role and they just focus on leading the others. But at the same time, they're not leading themselves and they don't understand themselves. Could you talk a little bit about that philosophy and how it's just so important to look into the mirror and lead yourself before leading others?
Yeah, so we all have tendencies. Every one of us. You have a tendency. I have tendencies. I have a long list of tendencies. I have a tendency to be defensive. Historically, I always will be defensive. They'll never not be defensive in my head, but my actions can change if I lead myself. So the key is actually knowing yourself. It's the bloke who wakes up every day. You know the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same things over and over and over, expecting different results. And so it's the leaders who don't know that they're driving other people away from them, or they don't know that they're losing influence, and they gloat in their style of management or leadership, even though it's really low. So knowing yourself is the key. So if you know your tendencies and you know what are the patterns, when you have these actions that are causing these negative consequences, then you will never change the tendency, but you can change the action. You can alter the pattern. And that's the key. And so I catch myself on a weekly basis 4, 5, 6 times go, oh, I was about to do it again, wasn't I? And it's catching that tendency and changing the outcome of the action will change the reality or the consequence and the outcome of those dialogues. That makes sense?
It definitely makes sense. And now let's get into the book. I think this is a good way to talk about the book. Could you give us a little bit of a sneak preview of what 100x means? Because I understand that there are some numbers involved, in calculating what number you're at, and then X also, there's a factor to that. Could you kind of explain the thinking behind this? I think it's super interesting.
Well, so this is my 5th book, and it's been a culmination of writing. And we pre-planned this book 3 books ago, and we've been writing towards it. And so we had a 3-book deal with Wiley, and so we had the 5 gears, 5 voices, and then the 100x leader. So they all kind of build on each other. And the 100x leader, I mean, you don't have to read the other 2. You can read the 100x leader to get it. But the approach, though, is the idea. We wanted to make a field guide of leader development that was so practical that people would use it on leaders, teams, and culture. So 100 stands for health. X stands for multiplication. The reality is that most leaders, the best leaders that we know usually are 75 plus. They're generally healthy. Maybe they're 75 to 80 plus. They're generally healthy, but they'll add value when you come to them. So it's like, hey, Andy, yeah, man. Hey, my door's always open. If you ever need anything, let me know. So I'm positively reactive. That is where most leaders are. 100x is someone who's positively proactive. So that means I'm fighting for your highest possible good. Andy, I'm seeing this is where you are, but this is who you could become, and I'm going to help you get to that next level, which means I'm going to support you, but I'm going to challenge you, and I'm going to help you get to that level that we all know that you could get to. That is a different type of leader, and there's just not enough 100x leaders in the world. Most of us have experienced, again, at best, 75 plus. So what most of us experience is that 60 minus leader, where they're not very healthy, and every time we meet with them, there's some cynicism or sarcasm, or there's just the jab or the passive aggression or what have you, and we feel nicked every time we're with them, a little bit depleted, subtracted from, every time we leave their office. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super interesting. Now, in the book, is there a way for people to actually assess what number they're on?
Yeah, it's true. Yes, there's something called the Peace Index, and we walk people through purpose and people and place, and then physical health provision, help them figure out why they may be lower, and how do you get that number from 75. There's a journey from 75 to 100 per se. The journey from 75 to 100 is hard, but the even harder journey is moving from a negative or a plus to an X. Most people know how to do self-help or, I'm going to do some goal setting, or I'm going to read a book and try to get better in certain healthy ways. And we have a lot of, books and resources around that, but there's very few resources moving from a plus to an X. How do you actually become a multiplier? It's a different mindset.
That's really cool. And I got to say 100X, how to become someone worth following. It's much better than 100X in math class. I can tell you that.
That's right. That's right.
Much better. So it's a lot more interesting. And I love the fact that, there's numbers and then you have the minus, the plus, and X. That's super interesting. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. Now, I just mentioned the title, How to Become Someone Worth Following. How does that happen? How does somebody become a leader that is worth following?
So we use the metaphor in the book of the Sherpa on Mount Everest. And I started doing this research on all these climbers of Everest, and I was, fascinated by it. And I started talking to them, and I kind of thought, it'd be the traditional, someone, they climb the mountain and then they made it to the top and they lift their hands and then they made it down alive. What really happens on Mount Everest is most of the people who get up and they raise their hands in this major victory pose, that's really, really short. Most of them are like, get me down, down alive, because it's so treacherous that they rely on the Sherpa. So a Sherpa is really fascinating. So I shifted the whole entire focus of the book to understand that the Sherpas are the real heroes on the mountains, not the climbers. So the Sherpa, they're a people group. I always thought they were like kind of butlers on the mountain and you hired them. No, they're actually a people group, and they're a Sherpa because their last name is Sherpa. Vanuru Sherpa, Niru Sherpa, Nibu Sherpa, all these different Sherpas I've talked to. So what happens then is they're born at 14,000 feet. So they have a genetic predisposition to the altitude. Their brain, their lungs, their heart can all handle the lack of oxygen, whereas the lowlanders, most of us, can't handle that. So that's where the metaphor begins. So to become someone worth following means that you're healthy enough to perform, to climb. So every day a Sherpa gets up and getting ready for the day, they go up ahead of all the climbers, make sure that the ropes are clear, make sure the ladders are there, make sure the paths are straight. So they've done all the hard yards. So they then come down, and then they're healthy enough to climb it again in the same day. So they climb up, make sure everything's good, climb back down, and then they're leading performers. Then it's actually getting people to the next level. So becoming someone worth following is someone who knows themselves to lead themselves, someone who is strong enough to have already been there where you're trying to go so they can climb. And then they have the ability to know how to not just perform themselves, but to lead those who are performing. And that's where leadership breaks down, because most leadership doesn't talk like this. Leadership is a culmination of performing yourself and leading other performers. And that's why the Sherpa metaphor is so perfect for the example of leadership.
Yeah, that metaphor is literally perfect for this. And let's pretend for a second that maybe, you're a leader and someone is working for you. Maybe they're not meeting expectations and you kind of have to challenge them a little bit to get better. What would be the best way to do that?
Well, I think you have to first, there's several things that go in. Okay, so you have to decide what level that they are on the mountain. So we use an analogy, we have a whole performance review process and at Giant, and people that use this on Giant TV. And what it does is basically says, okay, there's camps on the mountain. Okay, so on Mount Everest, there's actually Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, Camp 4, and then the summit. And you go from camp to camp, and you're acclimating and as you go up. Well, the same it's true for organizations, meaning there's levels. So you might have a first-time employee reception level. It might be a Camp 1 level. Then there's a Camp 2 level that's a little bit more important, supervisor. Maybe there's a director, VP level. And then you've got the C-suite at Camp 4. So at Camp 4, that's above the death zone on Mount Everest. It's really hard to breathe up there. So the higher the sea levels, the harder the job usually. So what we say is, first and foremost, you have to create the expectation of the role. So let's say, Andy, that I hired you, and I'm hiring you. I'm just playing here. Let's say I hired you at a C3 level. Okay. And that C3 level, it's a really important director role, with some VP responsibilities. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share the expectation that I've already created for that role. Andy, I expect, here's the job. The job is this, and I expect you to do A, B, C. I expect, here's how you help us win, and here's how you win. So by stating those expectations very clearly, I can then hold you accountable to the expectations. What most leaders do or don't do, they don't share expectations. They have expectations, but the employee doesn't know them. So when they don't meet the expectations, they then go and talk to someone else. It could be a peer. Man, can you believe that, Andy? Dang, I thought he was this, but he just, I don't know. Maybe I made the wrong choice. Maybe he's not cut up for it. Maybe. Well, have you shared the expectations? Does he actually know it? So support means that, look, this is where we're going. This is the tools. What do you need to help you get there? Then once I've supported you and shared the direction that we're going, I need you to be at camp 3. Then I'm now coming behind you. I'm seeing where you're undermining your influence. And if you know that I'm for you and a leader worth following versus someone that you have to follow, you'll listen to them and revere them because you know they're fighting for your highest possible good. And that's what's not happening, is most people don't know their boss is fighting for our highest possible good. The boss has expectations, but they're not slowing down long enough to share them with their people.
Yeah. It's all about clarity. I think clarity is definitely a key part in that.
It's called mutual responsibility. You're responsible, I'm responsible. Or the employee is responsible. So we use the analogy of a plant. A green plant wants to grow. And if I'm a gardener, I want it to grow. So if that's the case, it needs water, sunlight, and soil. So if I'm doing the best of my job, I'm positioning it to be able to have the best chance to bloom. Its responsibility is to grow based on my positioning of that plant. If there's a disease and there's something that's gone on inside that plant that won't allow it to grow, well, that's another conversation. I may have to move it outside of the greenhouse, so I don't want those mites or that issue to spread. This is where this goes to another one of our resources, a book called The 5 Voices. So every plant, when you go to the nursery or greenhouse, you buy a plant. It has a card, right? And the card in it says, this plant needs X amount of water, X amount of sunlight, and it needs this kind of environment. It's a cheat sheet. It tells you, most people who are not green thumbs, they just throw it away. They take that card and then they water everybody the same. They give everyone the same amount of sunlight. And then they're wondering why some plants aren't growing. So the 5 voices is what we've done. We've taken Jungian typology, where Myers-Briggs came from, and we've created a formula that's so much simpler to scale personality development. Enneagram, DISC, Myers-Briggs, all really, really good, but they don't scale very well because it's too hard to explain. So we've created and go, look, there's a nurturer, there's a guardian, there's a creative, there's a connector, and there's a pioneer. If you understand who you're talking with, then you can communicate. So knowing yourself to lead yourself is stage 1. Knowing your employee or your team to lead your team is stage 2. So it's a cheat sheet. We've given people the way to figure out, if I'm speaking to a guardian or a pioneer, they want short, bullet point, specific items. They're more thinkers, they're not feelers. So I'm going to have a different conversation to them about how to get to the next level than I would be a nurturer or a connector who are a little bit more feelers. I'm going to be a little bit more sensitive. And so to know your people and to lead them, then their reverence for you, their influence that you will have will increase. But most leaders don't take the time to do that. So they always receive average results.
Very fascinating. And the one thing I love about all the stuff that we're talking about right now, this all applies to your home life as well, your personal life. Yes, we're talking mainly about business and work right now, but a lot of these concepts you can also apply at home as as a parent, as a husband, as a wife, whatever it is. All of these things you can kind of think about when you're at home as well.
Absolutely. It's the same principles. With my kids, we teach something called the support challenge matrix in the 100X Leader book. And high support and high challenge, there's a matrix for it. So if you bring high support and high challenge, then you can liberate people. You can turn them green. There's opportunity, there's empowerment. But there's a fine line between high challenge and too low support. You can end up dominating people. Mm-hmm. Or high support, low challenge, you can end up protecting people, enabling them. So it's this balance, right? And so you've got to get really good. So I woke up years ago realizing, oh my goodness, I'm abdicating to my wife. I'm dominating my son. I'm protecting my oldest daughter, and I'm abdicating to my youngest daughter. So having these tools and these matrices, they actually help steer you. You go, oh my gosh, that makes sense. What would high support to my kids look like? What would high challenge look like? Well, I need to do it based on how they're wired. You may have heard this before, Andy. I obviously have heard the golden rule: do unto others as you'd want done to yourself. Mm-hmm. That means I don't need a hug. Why should you need a hug? Hey, I didn't get trained, so I expect you to. I was never trained, so why do you need training? That's the golden rule, and misapplied, but that is the golden rule. The platinum rule is do unto others as they would want done to themselves. So if you know who you're talking with, then you would do the platinum rule. Then you communicate based on their voice. Then you'll connect with them, and the chances of them getting to the next level go up.
Absolutely does. And looking back on it, obviously now you're a leader worth following, but was there ever a time in your career where you kind of looked in the mirror and you said, I'm not a leader worth following?
Oh man, for sure. And most of my career, I mean, I started young. I was 21 years old living in Russia. Right. And so the insecurity that was in me is very similar to the insecurity in most 20 somethings, most 30 somethings. But there's a point in time, I mean, I was 35 years old. We had bought John Maxwell's assets, and I was on stage with Jim Collins, and we were doing this event, and we had Jack Welch and all these big thought leaders. And I'll never forget the moment when I realized that externally people thought I was a rock star, but internally my team of about 45, they're like, yeah, he's okay. And I was like, oh, I'm conveying something externally. It's almost like a hypocrite. But on the inside, I wasn't someone worth following. I don't know if I would want to follow myself, because I had some insecurity. I had some passive aggression. I had some pettiness, those types of things that come from insecurity. And I look back at it, and it was the fulcrum, the business itself got me to a place where I saw failure, I saw weakness, and so instead of moping or instead of covering them up and faking them, hey, it is what it is. It's a tendency of mine. Mm-hmm. And once I admitted them, they had less power over me, and I started to work on them. And I'm like, yeah, I definitely have a tendency to be defensive. I have a tendency to embellish sometimes. I have a tendency to be petty. So those are tendencies. So now I just own them. And by owning them, I then can teach myself. I can teach other people. And I have grace for people, but I also have grace for myself. And I've learned how to liberate myself, not dominate or not abdicate. So I can tell you some horrible time stories, but that's the beauty. It's like, we need people who are vulnerable. We need people who will own that and not count that as a weakness that you have to hide. Yep. Or afraid of losing, but actually will get rid of self-preservation so that they can actually become someone that people want to follow.
100%. I think it all comes back to understanding yourself and using every opportunity as a learning opportunity. I think in order to get out of your comfort zone, you're going to have times where maybe things don't work out, or, you're just not getting the results that you want. But if you keep staying in the game and just continue on and try to understand yourself and develop yourself, eventually the results will come.
That's right. That's exactly it.
Now, one thing that's interesting nowadays, obviously you're with Giant TV, and the technology companies, technology has really changed the leadership world because, everything is done so quickly. Back in a long time ago, you kind of had to dial an actual phone, to reach somebody. And now everything is just so fast with the internet and everything. How has that changed the world of leadership? Because there may be a little bit of a focus to getting things done a little bit more quickly than maybe say 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, and we've become a full SaaS model. We call it a SaaS Plus because we have a consulting arm as well, but we're a subscription model. And so what we've found is a couple of things. There's 20th century leader development. It came from the Industrial Revolution where management started to, had to manage workers. But it was so much more of an apprenticeship process because it was more manual, assembly line, watch me. Well, then the digital age came, and all of a sudden it's hard to watch someone do an email and get better at an email, right? So it's hard to apprentice people. And so thought leadership changed. Leader development started to become more of a thing in the 80s and 90s, not management as much. So leader development comes online, and then that became a racket. It was a publishing boom. It was its own business. It was seminars and books. And so the 20th century has continued. It always takes about 10 to 15, 20 years for a new century to really adjust and adapt. So we started working in this that most adults are cynical know-it-alls that don't read anymore. Most adults they listen more, they watch more. And so agile, decentralized teams, all the things that technology has done. Well, what's done is it's actually given way to a way for people to scale because of technology, but no one's really figured it out. We think we figured it out, but it's about people development. In the past, people development was too expensive because you had to bring people into a room or fly them to go listen to people or buy these books and, all those things. Well, we've now made it like Netflix, like, Apple TV, Disney Plus, where it's $4.99 a month. Mm-hmm. Well, we've eliminated price as an issue. Then you have time as an issue. So we've started creating, because people are so visual and cynical, we started creating 3-minute, 5-minute, 7-minute, or maybe 15 minutes a week where you add a tool. We started creating visual tools instead of long bullet points because that's the way that people operate today's time. And then we started creating pathways and journeys for people. So it's a process over a year or longer, not just an expectation to go to a seminar and get watered for the entire year. So that's what's changed. But most people still haven't adapted. Most people are, okay, I have a digital book, but they're still writing like 20th century writers. Mm-hmm. And 21st century adult learning is completely different. And that's why we created Giant TV.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool that you have all those resources available. One thing that I always like to say on this podcast is you can be a leader in any role. Sometimes I think a lot of people focus on titles, and if somebody has direct reports and they think that only those people can be leaders, it can only be the managers.
Right.
How do you feel about that? Do you think that anybody can be a leader no matter what role they're in?
Well, I just don't. If it's helpful for people to have the conversation, I don't think that's the right question. Mm-hmm. Meaning, anyone can be a leader and learn to lead, but if you break up leadership into performance mm-hmm. and leading performers, that's a much better conversation to have, in my opinion. So the question is this: can anyone lead other performers? Sure. Are they the best person to do it? Mm-hmm. See what I mean? So anyone can.
Good point. Yep.
But are they the best? So if you have leaders in positions to go, number one, how are they on performing? So for instance, you might have someone who's a 9 out of 10 as a performer, but they're a 4 out of a 10 in leading other performers. But you might have someone else who's a 7 at performance, but is an 8 out of 10 at leading other performers. So I'd rather have that person leading those other performers. So it's usually ego and title that people chase. So, hey, if someone's a great performer, position them as a performer. If someone else can lead performers, way better. So do you call that person a leader? So it's this misnomer of what the word leader has become. Leader means I'm on top of the mountain with my arms up and look at me. Well, that's not what a leader is. A leader is the Sherpa, not the guy who climbed to the top. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes complete sense. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think it is important to think about the layers of leadership. I think from my perspective, I was talking about a leader being someone that influences others. Maybe they're not a manager. It's not their responsibility to lead others to produce, but they're setting the bar high. They're coming up with new ideas to improve the business. They're doing things that are above expectations, where, as your perspective, you're talking about someone who's actually in charge of leading others. It's their responsibility to make sure that these people produce. So it is very, very important to understand the layers of leadership. Now, one last thing too, how important is empathy in becoming a leader and developing relationships with people? That's another thing that we talk a lot about on this podcast. And Be Real, the E stands for empathy. How important is empathy in anything regarding leadership?
Well, so empathy, if you think of it in terms, you could say empathy and or sympathy, but I like the platinum rule better. Simply going, hey, if do unto others as they would want done to themselves. That is an empathy.
Yep.
So you become more effective in it. So we have this flywheel that called it's the high performing team flywheel. And the idea is communication and relationship have to be established. So relational trust has to be established before you can get people truly aligned and or truly executing. So what happens is, in most cases, are the pressure of the bosses from their bosses to make things happen. So they're like, come on, can we get everyone on the same page? Can we just make it happen? Come on. Well, they've not built relational trust. So at best, they're going to get compliance because people don't want to lose their job. So people will do just enough to keep their job, but that doesn't mean they're truly empowered. So to me, empathy and relationship, they're really a factor of empowerment. What do I want? I'm fighting for your highest possible good. I want us as a team to win. I want you to get to the best. I need you to get to Camp 3. I need you to get to Camp 4. I need you to be this role. So therefore, I'm going to do unto you what you need to help you become the best. That is a great leader. And that's the difference maybe that most people are pushing. And when they push without empathy or relationship, they just get compliance.
Very good point. And one last thing, I would like to just give you the opportunity now. Where can people find more information about what you're doing, and where can they find your books?
Yeah. So number one is giant.tv. And if you wanted to get a trial and just check it out, you can do giant.tv/JK. That doesn't mean joking, but that means Jeremie Kubicek. So giant.tv/JK. That gives you a chance. You can see what I'm talking about of this 21st century people development system. It's called, again, Giant TV. The others is just Amazon. Amazon has, their normal sales. I think 100X Leader is $12.99 right now. It's a pretty low price point for a hardback because it's been selling so well. And so there's people are really loving the book. It's fun because our writing style is very personal, very relational, very honest and open, but very, very practical. And so all of these tools, if you're listening, all of these tools that I'm telling you about are on Giant TV or they're in the book, The 100X Leader.
That's awesome. So definitely check that out. And I think personal things that you can apply are so valuable. So definitely check that out. We'll include a link to all of that here in the link of this episode as well. Jeremie, thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. Congratulations on all of the success with the books and Giant TV. We really appreciate you coming on. So thank you for joining us.
Andy, thanks, man. Great job. Appreciate your questions and wish you all the best.